Lieutenant Sarah Chun stared at the official document in her hands, the words non-essential personnel highlighted in yellow marker. The morning sun filtered through the small window of the military communications center, casting shadows across her desk cluttered with radio equipment and weather reports. She had been stationed at Forward Operating Base Delta for 8 months, working as a weather analyst and backup communications operator. Most days felt routine, checking atmospheric conditions, updating flight crews about wind patterns, and maintaining radio contact with aircraft. The base commander, Colonel Matthews, had made it clear during morning briefings that certain roles were considered secondary to combat operations. Sarah's position fell into that category. Despite her advanced meteorology degree and specialized training in aviation weather systems, the other soldiers often joked about the weather girl who spent her days predicting if it would rain or shine. They didn't understand that accurate weather forecasting could mean the difference between a successful mission and disaster. That particular morning brought unusual atmospheric readings. Sarah noticed a strange pressure drop on her instruments, something that didn't match the standard weather models she had been trained to interpret. The barometric pressure was falling rapidly, but the satellite imagery showed clear skies for the next 6 hours. Her computer models indicated normal conditions, yet her instruments told a different story. She double-checked her equipment, running diagnostic tests. To ensure everything was functioning properly, the squadron was scheduled for a routine reconnaissance mission over enemy territory at 1,400 hours. Captain Rodriguez, the flight leader, had already received his weather briefing from the primary meteorologist, who had reported favorable flying conditions based on standard forecasting methods. Sarah knew that questioning senior personnel was discouraged, especially when you were marked as non-essential. However, the inconsistent readings bothered her more than the potential consequences of speaking up. She spent the next 2 hours analyzing historical weather patterns for the region, cross-referencing her unusual readings with archived data from previous years. What she discovered made her stomach drop. The pressure readings matched a rare atmospheric phenomenon that had occurred 3 years earlier in the same area. That event had resulted in sudden, violent storms that appeared without warning, creating dangerous flying conditions that had forced several aircraft to make emergency landings. The communications radio crackled to life as ground control began final preparations for the squadron's departure. Sarah listened as pilots received their last-minute briefings, fuel calculations, and route confirmations. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the radio microphone. She could either stay silent and hope her concerns were unfounded, or risk her career by challenging the official weather assessment. The clock on the wall showed 13:30 hours, 30 minutes before takeoff. The decision she made in the next few minutes would determine whether she remained just another non-essential soldier or someone who could make a real difference. Sarah's finger hovered over the radio transmit button. She could hear Captain Rodriguez's voice coordinating with his wingman, discussing flight patterns and target locations. The hangar outside buzzed with activity as ground crews completed final aircraft inspections. Everything appeared normal, yet her instruments continued showing the troubling pressure readings that didn't align with official forecasts. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the transmit button. "Tower, this is Weather Station. Alpha, I need to speak with Flight Leader Rodriguez immediately regarding updated atmospheric conditions." The radio went silent for several seconds. Before the tower operator responded with obvious irritation, "Weather Station Alpha, all meteorological briefings have been completed. Squadron departure is in 25 minutes. Sarah persisted, knowing she might face disciplinary action later. "Tower, I have critical weather data that differs significantly from the standard forecast. Request immediate consultation with flight leadership." This time, Captain Rodriguez himself responded over the radio. "Weather Station Alpha, what's your concern?" "We've already received clearance based on favorable conditions." Her voice remained steady despite her racing heartbeat. "Captain, my pressure readings indicate potential for sudden storm formation within the next 2 hours. The atmospheric instability doesn't match computer models. but historical data shows similar patterns have resulted in dangerous flying conditions in this region. The radio silence that followed felt eternal. She could imagine the pilots exchanging glances, wondering if the non-essential weather analyst was trying to delay their mission. Colonel Matthews' voice suddenly cut through the static. "Lieutenant Chun, report to the command center immediately." "Captain Rodriguez, hold your position until further notice." Sarah's hands shook as she gathered her weather data and hurried across the base. Other soldiers stopped their activities to watch her rush toward the command building, probably wondering what the weather girl had done wrong now, inside the command center. Colonel Matthews stood beside the primary meteorologist, Staff Sergeant Wilson, who had provided the original favorable weather assessment. Charts and satellite images covered the large table, and Sarah could see Wilson's confident forecast showing clear skies and stable conditions. The colonel's stern expression suggested he wasn't pleased about the last-minute interruption to a planned military operation. "Lieutenant Chun, explain your concerns," Colonel Matthews ordered. Sarah spread her printed data across the table, pointing to the pressure readings and comparing them with historical weather events. Staff Sergeant Wilson examined her numbers with obvious skepticism, noting that his computer models and satellite imagery contradicted her manual readings. The tension in the room increased as Sarah realized she was challenging not only the mission schedule but also Wilson's professional reputation. "Sir, 3 years ago, similar pressure drops in this region preceded violent storms that formed within hours." Despite clear satellite imagery, Sarah explained, showing archived weather reports, the atmospheric conditions created a phenomenon where storms developed rapidly due to unique geographical features in the target area. Wilson countered that modern forecasting technology had improved significantly since then, and that her equipment might be malfunctioning. Colonel Matthews studied both sets of data, weighing the risks of delaying a scheduled mission based on one junior officer's concerns against the potential danger to his pilots. The decision would affect not only the day's operations, but also Sarah's future in the military. Outside, they could hear aircraft engines warming up as pilots waited for final authorization to depart. Colonel Matthews examined the conflicting weather reports for several tense minutes while aircraft engines continued running outside. Staff Sergeant Wilson maintained that his advanced computer forecasting systems were more reliable than Sarah's manual pressure readings, which could be explained by equipment calibration issues. The mission was already behind schedule, and delaying further would affect coordination with other military units in the field. "Lieutenant Chun, are you absolutely certain about these readings?" the colonel asked. Sarah nodded, knowing her career might depend on this moment. "Sir, I've verified my equipment multiple times. The pressure drop is real and matches historical patterns that preceded dangerous weather events," Wilson interrupted, pointing to his satellite data showing clear skies extending for hundreds of miles. "Colonel, we have visual confirmation of stable conditions. Delaying this mission based on unverified readings could compromise our operational objectives." The colonel made his decision. "We proceed with the mission as planned." "Lieutenant Chun, I want continuous monitoring of weather conditions with updates every 15 minutes once the squadron is airborne. If conditions change, notify me immediately." Sarah felt her heart sink, knowing she had done everything possible to warn about potential dangers. Wilson looked satisfied that his professional judgment had been validated. Captain Rodriguez received clearance for takeoff, and the squadron of 4 aircraft lifted off under clear blue skies. Sarah returned to her weather station with a heavy feeling in her chest. She continued monitoring her instruments obsessively, hoping her readings were wrong. The pressure continued dropping at an alarming rate, but satellite imagery still showed no visible storm formations. 30 minutes into the flight, Captain Rodriguez radioed his position and reported excellent flying conditions. The squadron was making good time toward their reconnaissance target, and visibility remained perfect. Staff Sergeant Wilson stopped by Sarah's station with a smug expression, suggesting that her concerns had been unnecessary anxiety. However, Sarah noticed that her pressure readings had now dropped below critical thresholds at 15:30 hours. Exactly 2 hours after takeoff, Sarah's worst fears began materializing. Weather stations 50 miles away suddenly reported rapid cloud formation and electrical activity. The clear skies that had persisted all day began changing dramatically as massive storm cells developed seemingly from nowhere. Her radio crackled with confused reports from other aircraft in the region, describing unexpected turbulence and visibility problems. Captain Rodriguez's calm voice soon turned concerned as he reported encountering unexpected cloud formations ahead of their position. Ground control, we're seeing rapid weather development that wasn't in our briefing. Requesting updated conditions for our return. Route. Sarah's instruments now showed severe weather patterns forming exactly where her calculations had predicted. The squadron found themselves flying directly into the path of violent storms that appeared to materialize instantly. Lightning strikes illuminated massive thunderheads that reached dangerous altitudes, creating hazardous flying conditions that threatened both aircraft and crew. Captain Rodriguez made the decision to abort the mission and attempt immediate return to base, but the storms were expanding faster than the aircraft could navigate around them. Sarah grabbed her radio microphone, knowing this was her moment to prove her worth. Captain Rodriguez, this is Weather Station Alpha. I have real-time storm tracking data that can guide you through the safest return route. The storms are following predictable patterns based on the pressure readings I've been monitoring. Her voice remained steady despite the chaos developing around the base as emergency crews prepared for potential aircraft emergencies. The next few hours would determine whether her persistence and challenging authority had saved lives or merely delayed an inevitable disaster. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio with increasing tension. Weather Station Alpha, we need immediate guidance. We're encountering severe turbulence and lightning strikes. Visibility is dropping rapidly. Sarah could hear the strain in his voice as the squadron fought against worsening conditions. The storms had developed exactly as her pressure readings had predicted, creating a dangerous maze of thunderheads and electrical activity. Sarah spread detailed topographical maps across her desk, combining her real-time pressure data with geographical features that influence storm movement. Captain Rodriguez, the storms are following valley systems and ridgelines. I can guide you through gaps in the weather pattern, but you'll need to trust my readings completely. Staff Sergeant Wilson rushed into her station, his earlier confidence replaced by obvious concern as reports of the severe weather reached the command center. Squadron leader, turn heading 270 degrees and descend to 8,000 feet, Sarah instructed, tracking the storm cells on her instruments. There's a corridor between two major cells that should remain clear for approximately 12 minutes. Captain Rodriguez acknowledged and adjusted course, but the other three pilots in his formation were struggling with instrument readings as electrical interference from the storms affected their navigation systems. Lieutenant Morrison, flying wing position, reported engine problems as lightning struck dangerously close to his aircraft. The electrical discharge had damaged several onboard systems, including his primary navigation computer. Ground control, I need emergency vectors. My instruments are malfunctioning, and I'm losing radio contact. Sarah realized that the pilot was flying blind in conditions that were deteriorating by the minute. Colonel Matthews arrived at the weather station as emergency. Sirens began sounding across the base. Lieutenant Chun, what's the situation? Sarah explained that the squadron was trapped in rapidly expanding storm systems, with one aircraft experiencing electrical damage. Sir, I can guide them home using my pressure tracking data, but they'll need to follow my instructions exactly. Any deviation could put them into the worst parts of the storms. The next 20 minutes tested every aspect of Sarah's training and intuition. She guided each aircraft individually through narrow corridors between massive storm cells, constantly updating their headings as weather patterns shifted. Captain Rodriguez maintained communication with his struggling wingmen while following Sarah's precise navigation instructions. The radio filled with tense exchanges as pilots reported hail damage and severe turbulence that pushed their aircraft to mechanical limits. Weather Station Alpha. Lieutenant Morrison is losing altitude rapidly, Captain Rodriguez reported. His engines are running rough, and he's having trouble maintaining level flight. Sarah quickly calculated Morrison's position relative to the storm systems and identified a small gap in the weather where he might attempt an emergency landing at a secondary airfield. However, the window of opportunity was closing rapidly as storms continued expanding. Morrison, adjust heading to 315 degrees immediately, Sarah transmitted. There's an emergency strip 20 miles northeast of your position. You have approximately 8 minutes before storms close that route. The pilot acknowledged weakly, his voice barely audible through increasing static. Sarah coordinated with the emergency airfield while continuing to track the movements of the other three. Aircraft. Staff Sergeant Wilson watched in amazement as Sarah's manual calculations proved more accurate than his computer models. The storms had developed exactly as her pressure readings indicated, following geographical patterns that the automated systems had failed to recognize. How did you know this would happen? He asked. Sarah continued working while explaining that certain atmospheric conditions in this region created unique weather patterns that required local knowledge and manual interpretation. As the minutes passed, it became clear that Sarah's intervention was the only thing preventing a potential disaster. Her detailed knowledge of local weather patterns, combined with her persistence in challenging authority, had positioned her to save the squadron when standard forecasting methods failed. The radio communications revealed the growing appreciation from the pilots as her guidance kept them away from the most dangerous storm cells. The tension reached its peak as all 4 aircraft approached the final phase of their emergency return. With fuel running low and weather conditions continuing to deteriorate around the base, Lieutenant Morrison's aircraft limped toward the emergency airfield with failing engines and damaged electrical systems. Sarah coordinated his approach while simultaneously guiding the other 3 aircraft through increasingly complex storm patterns. Morrison, you're cleared for emergency landing. Wind is gusting from the northwest at 25 knots with variable direction due to storm interference. The pilot's acknowledgement was barely audible. Through heavy static. Captain Rodriguez and his remaining wingmen faced their own challenges as fuel gauges showed dangerously low levels. The extended flight time caused by storm avoidance had consumed more fuel than calculated, and they needed to reach home base within the next 30 minutes or risk running out of fuel entirely. Sarah calculated their exact position and identified the fastest route through the weather maze. Squadron leader, turn to heading 180 degrees and increase altitude to 12,000 feet, Sarah instructed. You'll encounter moderate turbulence for 3 minutes. Then clear air for the final approach. Colonel Matthews stood behind her, listening to every exchange and realizing that the non-essential weather analyst had become the most critical person on the base during this emergency. The RADIO exploded with relief as Lieutenant Morrison successfully touched down at the emergency airfield, despite his aircraft's mechanical problems. Ground control, Morrison is down safely. Aircraft sustained significant damage, but pilot is uninjured, came the report from the emergency field. 1 aircraft safe. 3 still fighting their way home through deteriorating conditions. Sarah's instruments showed that the storms were beginning to merge into a massive weather front that would soon cover the entire region. The window for getting the remaining aircraft home was shrinking rapidly. Captain Rodriguez, I need you to increase speed and follow my vectors exactly. The storms are consolidating, and you have less than 15 minutes before your route becomes impassable. The base emergency crews prepared for potential crash landings as the squadron approached. Fire trucks and medical personnel positioned themselves along the runway while maintenance teams readied equipment for immediate aircraft inspection. Everyone understood that the success of this emergency return depended entirely on Sarah's weather guidance and the pilot's ability to follow her instructions precisely. Weather Station Alpha. We have visual contact with the base, Captain Rodriguez reported. Storm clouds are visible on all sides, but we can see the runway lights ahead. Sarah continued monitoring her instruments, noting that wind conditions around the base were still manageable despite the surrounding chaos. Squadron leader, winds are currently 15 knots from the east. You're cleared for straight-in approach. The first aircraft touched down safely, followed by the second, as ground crews rushed to secure them away from the approaching storms. Captain Rodriguez brought his aircraft in last, just as heavy rain began falling and lightning strikes became visible near the airfield. The squadron had made it home with minutes to spare before conditions became impossible for safe landing. As the last aircraft taxied to safety, Colonel Matthews turned to Sarah with an expression that mixed amazement with newfound respect. Lieutenant Chun, it appears your weather analysis just saved 4 aircraft and their crews. Staff Sergeant Wilson stood nearby, clearly humbled by the effectiveness of Sarah's manual forecasting methods compared to his sophisticated computer models. The immediate crisis was over, but Sarah knew that this event would fundamentally change how the base approached weather forecasting and emergency preparedness. Her persistence in challenging authority had proven that sometimes the non-essential personnel possessed critical knowledge that could mean the difference between success and disaster outside. The storms raged with full fury, creating exactly the dangerous flying conditions that her pressure readings had predicted hours earlier. The base settled into emergency protocols as the weather system moved through the area, while everyone involved began processing the events that had transformed a routine reconnaissance mission into a dramatic rescue operation. 3 weeks later, Sarah sat in a different chair facing a panel of senior officers conducting the official debrief. The formal investigation had examined every aspect of the emergency, from initial weather forecasting procedures to the successful rescue of all 4 aircraft. Captain Rodriguez sat at the witness table, having already provided his detailed account of how Sarah's weather guidance had navigated them through impossible conditions. The official report lay open on the table, and Sarah could see the highlighted section that still classified her position as non-essential personnel. However, the debrief testimony told a completely different story. Captain Rodriguez spoke clearly into the microphone, describing how Sarah's persistent weather warnings and real-time guidance had prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of aircraft and lives. Without Lieutenant Chin's intervention and expertise, our squadron would have flown directly into severe weather conditions that developed exactly as she predicted, Captain Rodriguez stated. Her manual weather analysis proved more accurate than standard forecasting methods, and her real-time guidance was the only reason we returned safely. The panel of officers listened intently as he detailed specific moments when Sarah's instructions had steered them away from dangerous storm cells. Lieutenant Morrison, recovered from his emergency landing, provided additional testimony about Sarah's coordination of his successful landing at the backup airfield. She calculated wind conditions and storm movements with remarkable precision, giving me the exact window I needed to land safely despite equipment failures, he explained. His aircraft had required extensive repairs, but investigators confirmed that the electrical damage would have been much worse if not for Sarah's early storm warnings. Staff Sergeant Wilson offered his professional assessment of Sarah's forecasting methods, admitting that her manual analysis had identified weather patterns that computer models missed entirely. Lieutenant Chen's understanding of local atmospheric conditions and her attention to pressure variations revealed a gap in our standard forecasting procedures, he acknowledged. Her methods should be integrated into our regular weather analysis protocols, Colonel Matthews read from his official findings, noting that Sarah's actions had exceeded normal expectations for personnel in her position. Lieutenant Chun demonstrated exceptional professional judgment, technical expertise, and courage in challenging established procedures when she believed aircraft safety was at risk. The formal language of the military report couldn't fully capture the dramatic nature of the rescue. Operation. The panel questioned Sarah about her decision to challenge the original weather forecast despite her junior rank and non-essential classification. She explained her analysis of the historical weather data and her interpretation of the unusual pressure readings. I understood the risks of questioning senior personnel, but the safety of the squadron was more important than following normal procedures, she stated clearly during the final phase of the debrief. The investigating officers revealed their recommendations for changes to base weather forecasting procedures. Sarah's manual analysis methods would be incorporated into standard protocols, and her position would be reclassified to reflect the critical nature of specialized weather analysis. The non-essential designation that had defined her role for months would be permanently removed. Captain Rodriguez approached Sarah after the formal proceedings concluded, extending his hand with obvious gratitude. "The official report might call you non-essential, but every member of my squadron knows you saved our lives." The other pilots echoed his sentiment, acknowledging that their safe return had depended entirely on her expertise and determination. 6 months later, Sarah received promotion orders transferring her to a specialized weather analysis unit, where her skills would be fully utilized. Her experience had demonstrated that military effectiveness often depended on individuals who possessed unique knowledge and the courage to apply it when circumstances demanded. The base established new procedures ensuring that all weather analysis personnel could contribute their expertise to mission planning. Regardless of their official classification, the squadron continued flying missions with enhanced weather support, and Sarah's story became part of the base training curriculum for new personnel. Her transformation from non-essential support staff to mission-critical specialist illustrated that true value in military operations came from competence, dedication, and the willingness to act when lives were at stake, regardless of what the official reports might say about someone's importance.